The United States military is getting out of Afghanistan.
It's up to the Afghans to make the decision about the future of their country.
Concern about the impact the withdrawal will have on the lives of Afghans.
At least 5 media stations, private media outlets that have been taken over by the Taliban.
And the impact at home, what the withdrawal means for one woman whose husband died in combat there, and how she's speaking out for families of the fallen. The inside story on how the U.S. military is pulling out as it vows to keep the counter-terror fight going. I'm Carla Babb, VOA's Pentagon correspondent. I'm in the Pentagon briefing room, where secretaries of defense, military generals, and press officers have briefed on military operations and policy. For the last 20 years, many of those questions have focused on Afghanistan. President George W. Bush first ordered troops there. President Barack Obama surged troop numbers in Afghanistan to more than 100,000. He watched as U.S. Special Forces killed al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in neighboring Pakistan before reducing troop numbers to fewer than 10,000. President Donald Trump struck a deal with the Taliban, promising to pull out all U.S. forces by May 1st, 2021. And President Joe Biden made good on that promise to withdraw, extending the deadline by a few months. VOA senior White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara takes us inside that decision.
I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome.
U.S. officials said the withdrawal will be completed by the end of August. Biden ordered it in April, concluding the U.S. has succeeded in degrading the threat of al-Qaeda, the group that attacked the U.S. on September 11, 2001. But with increasing Taliban attacks on key cities, many are concerned about the possibility of the Afghan government collapsing.
I don't think the Afghan military is as bad as some people paint them to be, but at the same time, I'm not sure they have the power to keep the Taliban from creating an all-out civil war, which would be just an absolute tragedy for Afghanistan.
Biden said the U.S. will continue to support the Afghan military, provide humanitarian assistance, and help protect women's rights. But he insisted that Afghan leadership must come together. Around 600 American troops will remain to guard the airport and U.S. embassy in Kabul. Analysts say there are other steps the U.S. can take to keep the Afghan government from collapsing.
We can find a way to get the Western contractors either back in Afghanistan in a safe part of the country or close by to keep the Afghan Air Force operational, if we keep the money flowing to support the Afghan military, and if we consider perhaps even using a limited amount of American air power against any big Taliban onslaught against cities, there is a chance that we can help the Afghan government hold on to large chunks of the country.
Meanwhile, thousands of Afghans are trying to flee the country, crowding the passport office in Kabul and hoping to secure exit visas before the U.S. withdrawal. Efforts are underway to relocate tens of thousands of Afghan interpreters and others who helped American forces. The administration said it has identified U.S. facilities outside of the continental United States and third countries where they will be housed temporarily while their special immigrant visas are processed. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
U.S. troops have steadily departed Afghanistan since President Biden's April decision to withdraw. So what's next for the U.S. military involvement there? And what are the terms of engagement at the end of August? In June, I traveled with the commander of U.S. military forces in the Middle East to bring you the inside story of America's new military posture. The United States is not planning to support Afghan forces with airstrikes against the Taliban once the U.S. troop withdrawal is complete. That's what General Frank McKenzie, the head of U.S. Central Command, told VOA in an exclusive interview while traveling to Europe and the Middle East. The United States forces are going to be striking the Taliban if they put Afghan forces in danger. That is continuing to go on right now, correct?
So long as we have forces in country. Those forces, as you know, are going to draw down to zero or at some point in the future. After that, any strikes that we do in Afghanistan are going to be against al-Qaeda and ISIS.
McKenzie said future counter-terror strikes in Afghanistan will be limited to instances where enemy plans have been discovered that aim to strike America and its allies at home, as when thousands were killed on September 11, 2001.
That would be the reason for any strikes that we do in Afghanistan after we leave. It would have to be that we've uncovered someone who wants to attack the homeland of the United States, one of our allies and partners.
For nearly 2 decades, Bagram Airfield served as the center of the U.S. fight to remove Taliban forces from power and take down al-Qaeda terrorists. The U.S. transferred control of Bagram to Afghan forces earlier this month. With U.S. airstrike capabilities out of Afghanistan, the U.S. will now rely on aircraft based more than 1,000 kilometers away to continue its counter-terror fight against Islamic State and al-Qaeda.
They come from a long way. It's a long haul to get forces, aircraft into Afghanistan from over the horizon.
But Bagram, losing it, clearly that's going to make things much more difficult.
It's going to be difficult. It's not going to be impossible.
Giving up that base is a real loss for American national security interests.
Bradley Bowman is a defense expert with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies who flew Black Hawk helicopters in Afghanistan.
We're going to have less visibility, less agility, less capability in taking the fight to our enemies in Terrorism Central. That's what's happening as a result of this political decision, this timeline-based, precipitous, conditions-ignoring, commander advice ignoring withdrawal that we're currently seeing from Afghanistan.
One way America and its allies increase their air power is through aircraft carriers. 2 allied carrier strike groups packed with weapons and fighter jets recently patrolled the region, including the brand new UK carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth. We boarded the crown jewel of Her Majesty's Navy during our trip with McKenzie.
What a carrier gives you is no questions about access, basing, and overflight. It's a part of national sovereignty wherever it goes. It's U.S. soil, just as this carrier that we're standing on right now is effectively United Kingdom soil. So that gives you a lot of flexibility.
After our trip to the region, McKenzie traveled to Afghanistan. The official end date of the U.S. troop withdrawal there will be August 31st. But this small military ceremony in Kabul was a symbolic end to America's nearly 20 years of war there.
But it's not the end of the story. It's rather the end of a chapter. More chapters will be written and the narrative will continue.
U.S. troops entered the country in 2001, targeting bases where al-Qaeda terrorists trained to launch the September 11th attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people.
And it's the right and the responsibility of Afghan people alone to decide their future and how they want to run their country.
The Taliban, who were toppled for harboring al-Qaeda terrorists, have accelerated attacks against Afghan forces since President Biden's ordered withdrawal began. They've nearly tripled the number of districts they control since May 1st, from about 75 to now more than 220 of Afghanistan's 407 districts, according to the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Long War Journal. The withdrawal is more than 95% complete, according to the military, with most Americans and equipment already gone.
We are certainly concerned about the prospect that the social, economic, political progress that has been made in Afghanistan over the last 20 years could be harmed or put at peril.
With just a short time until U.S. forces complete their withdrawal, retired General Joseph Votel, the former head of Central Command, told VOA that transparency with Afghan allies is key.
And I think we owe it to them to be as clear as we can possibly be so that we are planning against what it is our policy is, and they have a clear understanding of what it is that we are going to do, but also what we are not going to do.
The U.S. and NATO allies will continue to fund Afghan soldiers' salaries, help their Air Force with aircraft maintenance, and train Afghan troops. The latter two will be done outside of Afghanistan.
We're going to be giving them another 37 Black Hawk helicopters. That's more than they have right now. So, in effect, doubling their attack helicopter capability.
But to military experts who fear the Afghan military will fall once U.S. troops leave, those efforts aren't enough.
Just because we leave and we say it's over, it's not over. You know, we talk about forever wars. Well, the Taliban is interested in Al-Qaeda in a forever jihad, and they're going to keep fighting.
Hundreds of American troops will remain in Afghanistan to protect the U.S. Embassy and the international airport in Kabul. In his July 8th speech, President Biden did the math on 20 years of war.
After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces. 2,448 Americans killed. 20,722 more wounded, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health.
Landmark talks known as the intra-Afghan peace process are taking place between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Talks began September 2020. Both sides want a path to power sharing and a stop to what's described as Afghanistan's endless war. The Taliban brutally ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001 under strict Sharia or Islamic law. The end came when the United States invaded in its search for Osama bin Laden after the deadly 9/11 terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. Afghanistan formed a government led by Hamid Karzai, who promoted democracy and an open society. But the Taliban retained strongholds. The Afghan government, with support from the U.S. and NATO, has fought a protracted war. The conflict has claimed some 157,000 lives, more than 43,000 of them civilians. The Taliban and Kabul set benchmarks for the peace talks. Kabul wants a ceasefire, a power-sharing agreement, and rights in the constitution to be upheld. The Taliban want all foreign troops to leave, the release of around 5,000 prisoners, and rights to be aligned with Islamic teachings. The U.S., NATO, and others want a permanent ceasefire, the ability to deal with terrorism, and a firm plan to ensure a peaceful future in Afghanistan. Afghans are wary of a peace deal. Since talks began, a series of attacks have targeted journalists, members of civil society, and women. Media freedom and women's rights are protected in Afghanistan's 2004 constitution. Since the fall of the Taliban, the country developed a thriving media scene with female journalists at the fore. The Taliban have denied involvement in the attacks while insisting on Islamic law. The Afghan government has not laid out specific conditions to protect media freedom or women. That leaves many to question if freedoms gained over 2 decades of war will survive.
Foreign policy experts say 2 decades of war have changed the country's political landscape. Laurel Miller is a former acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the U.S. State Department. Here is her assessment of the American military drawdown and the geopolitical stakes at hand, in her own words.
There are questions about the strength of Afghan's government security forces. There are a lot of questions about the stability of the Afghan government. But even though the Taliban has gained ground in the last 5 years, especially in rural areas of Afghanistan, and put themselves in a position to be a threat to urban areas in Afghanistan and major transportation networks, what they have not been tested in doing since they became an insurgency is really taking over and holding any urban areas of Afghanistan. And the question more broadly in Afghanistan is what is going to happen happen in terms of the big picture at the national level? Are we going to see a Taliban-dominated government in the future, or are we going to see something that eventually, after a protracted conflict, looks more like power sharing and a patchwork of control by different groups in different parts of the country? It was easier, in a sense, to just keep trying than to stop and to really rip the Band-Aid off, so to say, in acknowledging that you're not going to achieve all of your aims. I mean, I think people have known for a long time that we didn't win the war in Afghanistan in a military sense, and that we weren't going to, in the sense of defeating definitively the Taliban. But the withdrawal really underscores that in a way that nothing else could. I mean, it is fundamentally an acknowledgement that the war is not going to be won, and we're just going to stop trying.
Nearly 2 decades after George W. Bush ordered the toppling of the Taliban, the former U.S. president told Deutsche Welle he is afraid Afghan women and girls are going to suffer unspeakable harm if the Taliban overrun the Afghan government. Many in Kabul agree. Here's VOA's Arash Arabasadi.
Recently, on the streets of Kandahar, a Humvee carrying Afghan special forces came under attack from Taliban fighters. The next day, the Taliban reportedly raised their signature white flag over a key border crossing with Pakistan. A Taliban spokesman released a video claiming to show a Taliban fighter standing at that border, pledging the group's allegiance to safeguarding Afghan security forces as well as local businesses. But Afghans say the Taliban is a threat to their way of life. Medina Sadat is a civil rights activist and mother of 2. She lives in Kabul and says the mood in Afghanistan is changing.
When the US and NATO and European countries got involved in Afghanistan, people started to live normal lives. But when foreign agencies decided to leave Afghanistan, a fear spread, especially among women. We are worried about what will happen to us and what will happen to our family members in the future.
Meanwhile, from his shop in Kabul, Murtaza, who has only been in business for a year, has his own concerns as a small business owner.
We want a better future, a future without war, without coronavirus, and without steep prices, because we all want a peaceful life.
He adds that uncertainty for his business rises as the Taliban's footprint grows.
I must say I'm very worried. Maybe many problems will multiply, and maybe I won't be able to support my family. Our biggest fear is that if the Taliban enter Kabul, it will create massive fear and terror in people's minds and drive them away from their homes.
Murtaza says the international community should do more to pressure the Taliban into joining a peace process with the Afghan government. Medina Sadat doesn't see that happening.
Taliban are the same as they were 20 years ago. The ideology is the same as before. Life under Taliban rule is like you are in a cage, especially for women. Like mothers around the world, I want the best life for my kids, a better and bright future. But I don't see that for kids with the Taliban's comeback. I worry their basic rights will be violated. I am fearful for my son, but even more worried about my daughter.
The Biden administration pledged ongoing financial support for the Afghan government, but those living increasingly close to the violence with memories of life under Taliban rule are concerned that pledge may not be enough. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
Advances by the Taliban throughout Afghanistan are a blow to media access and freedom of the press. VOA's Islamabad bureau chief Aisha Tanzim explains what's at risk in our Press Freedom Spotlight.
صدايا المراقبين استهداف دبابة واحدة النوم.
In Afghanistan, district after district is falling to the Taliban. The militant group has more than doubled the territory it controls in the last 3 months. A very public casualty of this takeover, freedom of the press. Nearly 50 journalists fled to safety, fearing for their lives. More than 20 media outlets have stopped operating. Others are forced to broadcast Taliban propaganda.
We have at least 5 media stations, private media outlets, that have been taken over by the Taliban. And through these 5 stations, Taliban broadcast their propaganda. They have also stopped broadcasting of music and voices of women.
In a WhatsApp call to VOA, Taliban spokesman Sohail Shaheen denied the allegations.
We only took over radio stations run by the Kabul government, since they were government-owned and we replaced that government. But private radio stations are allowed to operate, and we have told journalists to operate them normally.
Afghanistan was already one of the most dangerous countries for journalists. Last week, Pulitzer Prize-winning Reuters photographer Danish Siddiqui was killed in fighting. With the Taliban advances, entire districts have turned into news black holes. No one is verifying accusations of human rights violations from any side. And no one can verify claims of good governance by the Taliban either. Aisha Tanzim, VOA News, Islamabad.
Army Specialist Christopher Horton was a sniper who was killed in an ambush in eastern Afghanistan on September 9, 2011. He was 26 years old. His widow, Jane Horton, is an advocate for fallen soldiers and the families they leave behind, known as Gold Star families. She's also worked as a senior advisor to the Afghan ambassador and the U.S. Secretary of Defense. She took me inside her own visits to Afghanistan, her husband's legacy of service and sacrifice, and what the drawdown means to her.
This is him in Afghanistan. Chris was a man of honor. When I think about Chris in times like this, I think of everything he stood for and how much he loved this country. This is, I think, the last picture we ever took together. We never thought anything would happen to him. And seeing the number plastered everywhere, 2,400 were killed, 2,400 were killed. It just blows my mind that my husband was one of 2,400 that was killed in Afghanistan. That's the funeral. And when I got that knock, I knew that this life is no longer about me. This life was about telling people about men and women that are willing to fight, bleed, and die for them, and that love them so much and love America so much that they're willing to give everything. You know, people are watching Families of the Fallen. People are afraid to approach us. As people do care about us deeply, people haven't really stopped to ask what actually happens after the knock at the door. What is the process? So just working to make sure it stays on the mind of our people in power, because my generation is at home being mom and dad to their kids. And so they don't have time to make sure that people are remembering or paying attention. And so I'm pretty relentless with it because it's not about me. And if I can make one day easier for these families, I'll do anything I can do. Here's my first trip to Afghanistan. I got to meet General Austin, no, Secretary Austin. I wanted to go to Afghanistan and I wanted to learn about the country because my husband's blood is in their soil. And General Dunford brought me for the first time, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I was so excited to go. You know, that trip really changed my life. And so, you know, throughout the years of being involved in Afghanistan and getting to know the Afghan people, I really feel like they've given me part of my heart back. And so maybe we have to leave at a certain point. Maybe we don't. I know we already did, but we can do it better than we did. So the president said, would you send your sons or daughters, you know? And I would say, we have. I would give my husband 1,000 times over for this country, and he would give his life 1,000 times over. But what keeps me up at night and what haunts me is people don't know why he died. Why did he die in Afghanistan? And if we don't know that, then we really need to ask ourselves questions as a country on the why. If my husband walked in here right now and sat by us, what would we tell him? You know, and so as this is happening and the war is over now, everyone's asking Gold Star families this. Was it worth it? You know, how do you feel? And I'm like, how dare you ask us that? How dare you ask us, was it worth it? When that's the American people's question to answer. My husband wasn't mine. When I sent him off to war, I sent him off as America's. And so he was all of ours. And so I shouldn't have to ponder that question all day long without my country pondering it with me. And so I asked the American people to ask, was it worth it?
Powerful words. And as Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in this very room a few days ago, we owe the men and women who died in Afghanistan a debt we can never repay. That's the inside story for now. Follow the latest on Afghanistan at voanews.com or follow me on Twitter at CarlaBabVOA. We'll see you next week.
سرايا المرابطين استهداف دبابة